Welcome to Plant Medicine Transmissions with Javier Regueiro. In this episode of Plant Medicine Transmissions, I would like to continue the exploration of the theme of protections, of those protections that we create, that we put in place in order not to feel. In my work with plant medicine, oftentimes I have people who seem not to feel the effects of the medicine, or even more frustratingly, all they experience is a magnified vision of their inner landscape, which is composed only of thoughts. Both of these scenarios are most of the time an indication not that they haven't had enough medicine, but that at some point in their lives they shut down, they decided not to feel whatever was in that inner landscape of theirs. I distinctly remember the first time I drank ayahuasca. I prepared very thoroughly with both diet and inner contemplation. And what came during those contemplations was that I was terrified. I was not terrified of the medicine itself. I was terrified of meeting aspects of myself that I may have hidden for so long. I was not even aware of their existence anymore. Exploring my fears well before the ceremony resulted in my arriving at that first ceremony completely open and completely ready to receive whatever the medicine had in store for me that night. With many of my clients, instead of offering them more medicine, if I feel that indeed the medicine is already with them, then I invite them to explore whatever it is that may prevent them from fully opening up to the medicine. In many cases, I invite them to see if in their past, for whatever reason, at some point, they decided not to feel. They decided to close down emotionally, energetically, and that exploration often yields very positive results. The exploration is about actually honoring those contracts, honoring those protections, trusting that if we put those protections, those defense mechanisms in place, it was for a very perfectly valid reason. That reason may escape us in the present moment. We may have forgotten about it. However, that contract is still running on, and therefore it calls for integration. That integration entails, first of all, becoming aware of those protections, particularly around our hearts. When invited to explore those protections, most of my clients actually can feel those protections. Sometimes they seem like a wall around their hearts. It can feel like a bubble, an insulating bubble. Oftentimes it's just a numbness, and oftentimes it is simply a wall of mind chatter. A mind chatter that is supposed to silence what we may hold beneath that chatter. Once we connect with those protections, we can go further in and actually feel what the nature of that protection was and see the purpose of that protection. Once we become aware of the nature of that contract and we take full responsibility for the creation of that protection, then we can actually see whether we would like to continue holding on to that contract and to that protection. As part of that process, it is also important to honor ourselves for putting these defense mechanisms into place and to honor that defense mechanism fully rather than resenting it. Oftentimes, during a ceremony, people will resent these protections, this inability to feel, to allow the medicine to touch them on a deeper level. But that resentment does not help things. Rather, it's important to honor our own history and to see how these defense mechanisms were vital in our own survival, what may have been important, perhaps even necessary for our survival, for our well-being in the past, is not necessarily valid in the present moment. And for me, the main message of plant medicines for us at this point in history remains the message of letting go of what may have been important, perhaps necessary in the past, but no longer is. We are creatures of inertia. Oftentimes we are not fully in the present, and our present life is ruled by past dynamics and past contracts. But when we take responsibility, when we own the fact that we put those defense mechanisms into place, then it's easy to resign them and to let them go. Things do get a little bit more complicated in the case of these defense mechanisms that we have disowned the creation thereof. This is the case of entities. Entities are not particularly diabolical as the literature implies. Entities are oftentimes creations, thought forms that we disown completely and therefore take on a life of their own. The creation or the hosting of entities, whether benevolent or not benevolent, is never an accident. We do that, we welcome these energies and oftentimes create them in order to support us, in order to make us feel less overwhelmed, more protected and safer. Letting go of these defense mechanisms, whether they're entities or simple protections of any kind, takes actually a lot of courage. Before we let go of this protection, it's very important for us to be very honest with ourselves and to ask ourselves whether we are really willing to continue walking on our journey without that precious and comfortable and familiar protection. Without that examination Oftentimes what we do is we do let go of that protection, but unconsciously we are still holding on to it. Therefore, the process is nullified. The perceived need for protection always points to fear. And all of us, to a degree or another, are in the grips of fear and doing our best to avoid feeling that fear and meeting that fear. The letting go of protective mechanisms will entail the opening of a lid that has been closed for a long time. Entails facing things that we may not even be conscious of anymore. And therefore, it's not a process to be taken lightly. It's a process that also asks for a supportive environment, a supportive also network that can hold us in these first steps out of the tower that had protected us for so long. It is therefore no surprise that people oftentimes do not feel the effects of the medicine in the same way that they may go and see a therapist and nothing much happens. That is because the person is still protecting themselves and not quite yet ready to open up to themselves, to open up emotionally, and to truly explore their inner landscape. There are cases where I see that actually drinking some more medicine is the only way to break through a barrier that my client is sitting on. However, for some of these people, the experience turns out to be overwhelming. First of all, because of their defense mechanisms, they are no longer used to actually feeling and experiencing. And therefore, there is a lot of backlog and an inability, lack of familiarity with their own inner landscape, which may result in an overwhelming experience. It is very important to remember that more medicine is never necessarily a solution. Drinking more medicine does not necessarily mean that we are going to be able to overstep our own resistances. Actually, on the contrary, those resistances may actually become even more accentuated so that we can become aware of them and work through them, but not step over them. I have mentioned numbness as one of the expressions of defense mechanisms. And there is nothing more frustrating for someone than to join a ceremony and not feel anything. However, that numbness is not a nothingness. It is an experience. It is a creation. And if we actually go into that numbness, rather than wishing to feel something more exuberant, more clear, if we go into that numbness, oftentimes what comes out of that exploration is exactly that contract, that decision not to feel, that must be once again looked at and possibly integrated if the person wishes to go deeper in their exploration. Defense mechanisms also include the creation of identities. For instance, the identity of the rational thinker, the identity that keeps a tab on everything, that observes everything without actually experiencing it from an outside place. And another identity that is very common in plant medicine circles is the spiritual identity. We create for ourselves an identity, an ideal of who we ought to be, of how we ought to feel, based on resistances, based on judgments that say that certain aspects of ourselves, certain expressions of ourselves are not spiritual or are not okay. This spiritual identity, this spiritualized attitude is often easy to spot in people who attend the ceremonies, because they are perfect. They come with the right dress, they come with the right accessories, they sit in perfect lotus position with their back very straight. And to those people, I actually invite them right away to lay down instead of holding that stance. These are also people who are often meditators, who have a meditation practice, and unconsciously that meditation practice turns into a posturing, into an identity. It turns into a bubble that prevents the medicine from truly touching them. In the same way that we create defense mechanisms, we also create identities, attitudes, in order to avoid, for instance, rejection, in order to prove to other people that we belong to the club. In certain medicine circles, a certain code of behavior is asked of the participants, for instance, sitting up straight throughout the ceremony. In my case, since I work most importantly with foreigners, with Westerners, and I know from my own experience the strain that we put on ourselves in order to conform, in order to belong, then at the beginning of my retreats, I always stress how we are not here to perform, and that our ceremonies together are not performances. If anything, they are an opportunity to let go of our perceived need to perform. I really appreciate the format of Amazonian plant medicine ceremonies, because these ceremonies have a minimum of ritual, a minimum of rules, a minimum of activities connected with the ceremony, because it is understood that the process is really about the medicine and the relationship with the person ingesting it, and not based on ritual and on doing. This, of course, is not a standard, and it's important to ask well before the ceremony or the retreats what kind of ceremonies and what kind of behavior, if anything, is expected of the individuals joining them. Plant medicine ceremonies are, in my opinion, just that, healing ceremonies and not performances. And therefore, whenever we find ourselves in performance mode, we may also ask ourselves, what is it that I'm trying to avoid feeling? What is it that I am, by doing something, by performing, am I avoiding experiencing? Blessing.